Here it is. Is it starting? What? Do that? I don't see it. I don't see it on here though. Yes, there we go. There we go. Okay, great. Hello, everybody. I am so sorry for this confused start. We had some technical difficulties, but we are now going to start the symposium for Friday, September 19th. And we are in a quite, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche said earlier today, a sort of unbelievable situation with all kinds of things occurring in different directions. I'll just take a few of the big ones, which is that we just had President Trump being brainwashed as best they could in the UK with his visit where he this pomp and circumstance is so stupid. It's such anathema to the principles of the American Revolution. So they're sitting there at these big dinners where people are wearing their little crowns and jewels and big costumes. And Helga said it reminded her of an opera. It reminded me of a dollhouse. And then giving these crazy speeches about the US-UK special relationship. Now, happily, at the end of that, President Trump had a phone call today earlier with President Xi Jinping of China. And what he said about that is, I just completed a very productive call with President Xi of China. We made progress on many very important issues, including trade, fentanyl, the need to bring the war between Russia and Ukraine to an end, and the approval of the TikTok deal. I also agreed with President Xi that we would meet at the APEC summit in South Korea, which I think is near the end of October, that I would go to China in the early part of next year, and that President Xi would likewise come to the United States at an appropriate time. The call was a very good one. We will be speaking again by phone, appreciate the TikTok approval, and both look forward to meeting at APEC. So that at least is a step in the right direction while we have houses of horrors unfolding elsewhere on the planet, like the Israeli ethnic cleansing in Gaza now ongoing, where they gave 48 hours for 1 million people or so to leave Gaza City. In the north, many people can't move. They're injured, they're starving. They don't want to move. This is their land, their home. They've been back and forth 1 million times. Some number of them are packed into roads, just jam-packed, can barely get out of there, going for Bibi Netanyahu's final solution, which I think really is the Jared Kushner real estate plan, or what Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, said, we'll have a real estate bonanza over the dead bodies of what probably is hundreds of thousands of people, because no one really knows. The death figures that we have are just based on people whose names are known, and that's well over 65,000 individuals. So I'm sure it's much higher than that. And there was yet another resolution for a ceasefire brought before the United Nations, the UN Security Council. The vote was 14 in favor, and the US alone in the Security Council vetoed it once again, which I find really sick and anathema. So it's a tough world. The backdrop of all of this is the bankruptcy of the transatlantic system. Lyndon LaRouche famously said in July of 2007, there is no possibility of a non-collapse. None. He did not know at the time that the monoline insurers, which insure these various derivatives deals and so on, went under 3 days after that webcast. A year later, you had the crash of 2008. What was done to address the crash of 2008 was to do more of the same things that had caused it. Concentrate the money in the hands of the very financial institutions that made the mess, bloat them up bigger and bigger, And so here we are with a gigantic unfillable bubble of derivatives obligations held by the City of London and Wall Street. You have a movement of the global South out of colonialism. They don't like being brutalized by the dollar, by our system, and they're not going back. You're not going to make 6 billion people go back into slavery. It's not happening. And so what you have is this Anglo-Dutch oligarchical elite, desperate, unleashing every form of terror and manipulation to try and somehow put this process back in the bottle. And in this period, I've often looked back to I think, one of the best things that the LaRouche movement ever produced, which is this little book here called The Children of Satan, which has Dick Cheney, who is that? Wolfowitz, Feith, Ashcroft, I'm not sure, Rumsfeld there on the cover. And it had a section about something that I had never heard of before called synarchism. And this chapter was called The Fascist Roots of the Wolfowitz Cabal. Now, remember, this book came out in 2004. We were fighting to get Dick Cheney impeached. We used to go out on the street with signs that said, impeach Cheney first and then the monkey, meaning Bush. And we did so much on Leo Strauss from the University of Chicago, the ignoble liars, the policy of running your policy through lies and intimidating people, not because people didn't know they were lies, but because they knew that you made them feel powerless to tell the truth. So we're in a situation now where you had an assassination attempt on President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania in July of last year. We had a successful, tragically, assassination of Trump's good friend, the 31-year-old Charlie Kirk, who was the leader of most of the young people supporting Trump. And this happens at a time where Kirk was actually shifting his view on certain things, particularly Israel, and also I think his own faith, moving towards Catholicism, away from some of this Christian fundamentalism, recognizing, as Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that we seem to have this peculiar necessity funded by billionaires like Miriam Adelson and Bill Ackman, that everything is quote unquote Israel. And I'll say it's not benefiting Israel. Israel is becoming isolated and may not even survive what they're doing. But a very evil policy. And so I know Cliff Kiracofe, who is a former senior staffer for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has done a lot of research on this. I wanted to ask you, Cliff, to please say something about the events going on and this question of synarchism, which I think is actually quite relevant right now.
Okay, Diane, thanks for having me on the show. As a matter of fact, I worked on that Children of Satan report myself with Jeff and some of the others back in the day. Where the reason I introduced the idea of synarchy was because I had been researching a political movement, a secretive political movement that was in France, which was exposed during World War II, and it was called synarchie, which is the French word, or synarchy in English. And the concept, I'll explain how it was developed and what it means, and who's participating. The relevance of that is that it is one explanation of some circles who are, we can say, the globalists circles, the powerful international circles. So the synarchy involves some of those folks in that very high level. And working down from that high level, some people have suggested that the Kirk assassination was done by globalists of some kind to keep him quiet about um, the evils of Zionism, Gaza, and so on, and also to because of that to remove him as an influence, as you pointed out, to millions of young people. I had frankly never heard of Charlie Kirk until a couple of months ago when I noticed my timeline that he was a conservative evangelist, I guess should say, to the college student generation. Getting back to Synarchy, I want to read you just so we realize we're not imagining things, that some people try to deny the existence of the synarchist movement, which is an elitist globalist group of people, let's say, that's been around for a long time. I'll read just briefly a couple sentences from a book by Professor William Langer of Harvard University. He wrote a book called Our Vichy Gamble, which was the official history of the U.S. relationship with Vichy during World War II. Vichy was the occupied German government of France at that time and had a lot of collaborationists in it, collaborating with the Nazis, who were the occupiers. And so I'll just say that he says in this book, there was a policy of collaboration with Germany that it could count on more than enough eager supporters among French industrial and banking interests. In short, among those who even before the war had turned to Nazi Germany and to Hitler as the savior of Europe from communism. And then a little later in the paragraph, um, they dreaded the Popular Front, which was a progressive movement in France, like the plague, and were convinced that they could prosper under Hitler's iron rod. Many of them had long and extensive business relations with German interests and were still dreaming, now wait for this, of a new system of, quote, synarchy, unquote, which meant government of Europe on fascist principles by an international brotherhood of financiers and industrialists. So that's the definition that Professor Langer, writing in his book, Our Vichy Gamble, published in the United States back in 1948, which was an official history. Langer had been with our intelligence services during the war and was well, obviously informed on European affairs, as he had written several books on European affairs. I'll just show you a couple of books so you realize that there is such a thing, or scholarship on synarchy. Here's the most famous and a very rare book on synarchy. It's sort of hard maybe to see. I can put it by my face, I don't know. But it's by Geoffroy de Charnay. It was published in Paris in the 1940s. That was a pen name. There are several books on the founder of synarchy, and that's what I want to go to next. The founder of this synarchic movement or ideology was a French occultist way back in the 19th century. His name was Joseph Alexander Saint-Yves, Marquis d'Alvedra. So he was born in 1842, died in 1909. And you can look him up in Wikipedia, which I'm reading from right now. Was a French occultist who adopted the works of Fabre d'Olivet, and in turn his ideas were adopted by Gérard Encausse, and these were French occultists believing in black magic and Kabbalah and all these kind of weird secretive things. So Saint-Yves d'Alvedra then created a concept, an ideology of synarchy, and wrote a number of books about it. And one of them, The Mission of Sovereigns, that's Mission de Souverain, that he wrote. That's an original edition. And then there are a number of biographies about Monsieur Dalvedre. And so what happened was this occult network adopted the idea of elite rule. That is to say, it was opposed to what they called the anarchy of politics in Europe, and they wanted to oppose anarchy with its opposite, synarchy, which, as I just read from Professor Langer's book, this is the origins, or part of the origins of certain fascist movements in Europe, which developed in the 1920s and 1930s in France, and also, as we know, fascist movements developed in Spain and Italy and so on. But this particular group, the Synarchy group that Saint Yves Dalvedre founded, um, had a link to the Fabian Society in England. And Diane just mentioned the big banquet and all that, the sort of freak show banquet that they had the other day. Um, so this synarchic movement in France, sort of an occult, secretive movement, linked up with the political movement of the Fabian Society in London. Now, which was started in 1884, by the way. And the way they linked into the Fabian Society was through the British Theosophical Society, which was a part of or a branch of the Fabian political societies. And the Theosophical Society was an occult group believing in magic and mumbo jumbo stuff. Now, as I just read in the Langer book, this secretive society developed in the 20s and 30s. It was an elitist club, let's just call it that. And this elitist society, secretive, behind the scenes of industrialists and bankers, supported Hitler because they thought he would dominate Europe and they could line up with him. But then, as the war turned against Hitler, uh, particularly owing to the Russian um, um, military victories, the synarchists shifted slightly and then more fully to the Allied side. Now, what I want to point out there is that the synarchists started supporting Hitler when it looked like he wouldn't be the master of Europe. They shifted to the Allied side to penetrate the Allied side. Some of the vectors of the synarchist movement in France were banks, particularly Lazard Frères Bank, which had a branch in New York City. Thus, the synarchic movement in Europe and France had a base in New York City through the Lazard Frères Bank and other bankers and so on. So now we're in the 1940s and post-war era, and those circles seeking of industrialists and bankers were seeking influence, political influence over the United States and European countries, and also over the foreign policies and economic policies of those countries. So that's kind of the origin of this particular network, the Synarchy network, um, in Europe. Now, I will also point out that when I was researching this in France a number of years ago, I found from friends and colleagues there that the Synarchy movement had penetrated in the 1920s French Freemasonic organizations, particularly the Grand Orient of France. So there was a merger then of these occult Synarchy society penetrating into normal Freemasonic lodges and Grand Lodges in France. So you have that interrelationship among elites. So what we're dealing with here, and I'll wrap it up quickly and we can go into questions and answers, but what we're dealing with is an elite group of a fraternal organization, you could say, of bankers and industrialists. And what does this remind us of? Well, it can remind us of the Trilateral Commission, started by Brzezinski back in the day and the Rockefellers back in the 70s. The Trilateral Commission was a group of industrialists and bankers and so on, trying to coordinate foreign policy. We can think of the Bilderberg Group that was established in the early 1950s in Europe, also under some British influence. And that also is composed of high-level elite bankers and industrialists and others, maybe some journalists and things along those lines to do the PR work. But it's an industrialist and bankers group, the Bilderberg Group. And that was a center-left orientation, centrist center-left. And then you had a right-wing secretive group, which was called the Pinay Circle, Pinay. He was a French politician. And this secretive society, the Pinay Cercle Pinay, was named after him. And it was also um, composed of elitist movers and shakers in the banking and industrial world and also intelligence world. So this synarchy also interfaces with the intelligence, certain circles in the intelligence world, CIA, MI6, and so on. So what I'm getting at is trying to explain how what political scientists and political sociologists refer to, we refer to it as transnational elites. So if you look up the topic of transnational elites, you will see political sociologists, political scientists, and such writing on the theories of transnational elites and the activities of transnational elites. And of course, what we see the WEF by that fellow Schwab in Switzerland, very powerful these days. WEF, World Economic Forum, movers and shakers. Who are they? Bankers and businessmen, uh, and so on. So this just gives you a little bit of a framework to understand that this concept of getting bankers and industrialists together to gain political power, um, imperial power, we can say, at the globalist, like we call them globalists today, is over 100 years old. So we're not dealing with a new phenomenon. And political scientists, historians, and sociologists will have written books and scholarly articles on this phenomenon. It's not so well known except for specialists who get into the weeds on this topic. But I think that's where I'll leave off right now. And as we noticed at the banquet in England that Diane mentioned, who were the American guests there? Well, they were all the Silicon Valley people and industrialists and bankers, American bankers, all dressed up like in their fancy little black, not black tie, what do they call it? White tie outfits. And so that you could say is an example of the type of elitism that the Synarchy and other networks, transatlantic networks, and global networks also operate in. So with that, I hope that's a good introduction for you all. I do
Great.
want to assure you there's plenty of scholarly articles out there on this topic.
Well, thank you. There's a bunch of comments and questions that came in. Maybe I'll ask you to respond and then Dave can pick up where you left off. If that's all right, Dave, with you. Just remember to unmute when you start, Dave. But from the Q&A, someone asks about Gladio World War II stay-behinds. Someone brought up the name Aleister Crowley. Someone asked, is Permindex part of this? And then we get to Palantir and so on. But do you want to say on anything about, and the Black nobility? Is there anything you want to say about these things, Cliff?
Sure, I would say the way I would respond to that would be that this synarchy network, um, working through various elites um, in Europe in particular, and then on banking circles and in industrial circles in the United States, um, this particular network we refer to as globalists, and I will point out that they did engage in assassinations. One of the famous assassinations they did was Admiral Darlan, a French admiral in World War II. They wanted to get him out of the way. So the group is, as I indicated, high-level bankers, high-level industrialists, and so on, seeking political and economic power. And so now that would be my response. Of course, this can involve so-called black nobility, aristocratic people in Europe, whatever, various Freemasonic organizations, or even occult, Rosicrucians or whatever, kind of oddball occult societies are out there. And Crowley, of course, was very involved in the various occult societies, not only in England, but in Italy and in Europe. So Crowley was part of an international occult group. I don't know if he was connected with the Synarchy, but certainly he's sort of in parallel with them with all this occult mumbo jumbo stuff. So that's how I would characterize that. It's an elite, secretive, globalist, we would say today, a group of people seeking power and wealth.
So, Dave, what thoughts do you have on this nasty mess? I mean, my first thought while you're unmuting there is that why would anyone want to bother to engage in this? It's so much more fun to be human and interact normally with people.
Mm.
But Dave, go ahead.
Well, I think for these types, some of them represent the ancient, the fondy, right? The money, the interests, or the financial and ultimately political wealth. That's the heritage they come from, the old imperial systems. When Venice moved their operations from Venice. The Venetian Empire moved up into the Amsterdam and eventually over into London. That, of course, was the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. So these people have a legacy of maintaining their wealth, their power. And they never really got into that whole human thing. In fact, they just sort of view the humans as cattle. So I would just say I didn't really have any sort of prepared presentation, but just in reflecting on some of what Cliff was going through, and also just sort of remembering what we were covering around the children of Satan and the neocons and the Straussians and this matter. A lot of how they are able to control, run the large scale social engineering, social control methods are indeed by pitting people against each other, pitting the left versus the right, which of course is certainly relevant today because we have this sort of reaction to the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and the sort of the crackdowns. There was Pam Bondi's, the Attorney General, initially saying that we're going to start going after hate speech and targeting hate speech, which of course many people made the point that everything that Charlie Kirk stood for, which I didn't really know him very well either, but his people that knew him knew that he would have been appalled at such ideas. But anyway, and then you can see the crackdown on the left-wing extremists, and of which of course there are, just as there are right-wing extremists, right? But the synarchist type crowd have always played that game. And I think just for me, I've just been reflecting on following the fall of World War II, or the end of World War II, and sort of the formal end of the British Empire as they had overextended themselves. And of course, the fact that Franklin Roosevelt made it very clear to people like Winston Churchill, directly to Winston Churchill, that we didn't fight a war against fascist economic slavery so you could continue your fascist colonial slavery policy. So the British began to move their empires into that of the empires of the mind. And of course, central to that was the ultimate sort of gang counter gang, if you will, which was the dividing the world behind the Iron Curtain. Notably, the fact that these were our allies that were on the other side of the curtain, namely Russia and China, who had fought with us to defeat the Nazis, and the same Nazis that the synarchist type forces played footsie with and directly worked with, as Cliff just went through. But as the sort of the new phase of the British Empire came in, it was done through the fear of nuclear weapons and the Cold War dynamic. It was done through the kind of the psychological warfare methods that we saw, much of it based on the fear of nuclear weapons, in terms of being able to pit people against each other. And then, of course, we had the whole geopolitical power play between, which side were you with, the communists, were you with the free world, and then the battleground in the battlegrounds in Asia, the battlegrounds in Africa. So as far as just some, I think the plays that we saw, like especially in the time of Hitler, when the Reichstag fire burned down, they tried to blame that on the communists, right? But of course, it was the Nazis that actually did it. But that's how they played that beginning of the gang counter gang operations then. That flowed into things like Gladio and so on. There was the case of the Red Brigades, who were a nominally communist group that were blamed for the kidnapping and assassination of Aldo Moro. Then, of course, you bring in the other side to sort of clamp down on that. So a lot of this, the way that it worked in terms of policy is that in a military strategy, it was done through counterinsurgency. That was sort of the idea. So you'd have in Kenya, you had the uprising of the Mau Mau, and then you'd support the other side, the Kikuyu, and then of course you bring in the sort of the policing methods to maintain stability, and all to the benefit of the elites that were attempting to manage nations of Africa and around the world. And so I think a big part of that was the whole matter of winning hearts and minds. That was the kind of the doctrine of psychological warfare for this counterinsurgency apparatus. And so indeed the whole question of psychological, psychological warfare on populations was crucial, the propaganda efforts and so on. And so I think, if you just fast forward to where we're at today, I think a lot of the attempt to pin people into this left-right paradigm, it's just failing. I happened to watch this, I think it was Tucker Carlson's show where he was doing a sort of a memorial for Charlie Kirk. And he had this guy, Cenk Uygur, I think his name is, from the Young Turks. And clearly on the left, if you will, or he probably would identify in the so-called left. But what he noted in his conversations with Charlie Kirk is that at a certain point, he saw that they agreed on matters of Wall Street's control over Wall Street's overt control over the economy, and that wasn't good for people. He also was, they both agreed on the question of the neoconservatives. And it just struck me that is actually the true America, where there may be people from the left or the right in terms of particular orientations, but at the end of the day, they don't like Wall Street running the economy. They don't like the bailouts. They don't like endless warfare. And I think that's certainly what Trump tapped into. And so I think, at least with the case of Charlie Kirk and some of the other operations, is there's an attempt to then try to create now this gang, counter gang type operation between left and right that I personally don't think exists. So I would just say that as just a couple of quick thoughts on some of what Cliff was raising and how these forces operate in the world today.
I mean, there's definitely an effort to do this gang counter gang. I was just beginning to look through this book, and one thing really leapt out at me on the synarchism question, and there's discussion of this group called the Family and the Prison Fellowship Ministries, which I don't know what the name of Miriam Adelson's outfit is, but she has some prison thing also. And in fact, she got her start in methadone, actually. She's a medical doctor, so that was her big uh, thing. But so they talk about this head of the family, Doug Coe, and the reason it leapt out is because Bibi Netanyahu has not once, but on multiple occasions, praised Genghis Khan, and he loves to quote this bizarre historian, Doug Welder, something or other, I can't remember the guy's name, who says history is not made by the weak, history is made by the strong. History favors Genghis Khan over Jesus Christ, which is a pretty wild idea, actually, and completely wrong, because what you discover about human beings is actually our most important contributions don't exist in the physical domain. What is eternal is not what's in the physical domain. It's something greater. That is the power of Christ, or a belief, the relationship between human beings and the creator. But listen to this. So this character, Doug Coe, this is Doug Coe's son, who is teaching the trainees in this family. The writer says you might call it the gospel according to Genghis Khan. So they say he walked to the National Geographic map of the world mounted on the wall. You guys know about Genghis Khan? He asked. Genghis was a man with a vision. He conquered. Dave stood on the couch under the map, tracing with his hand half of the northern hemisphere. Reminds me of Bibi Netanyahu with his Greater Israel. Uh, Nearly everything. He devastated nearly everything. His enemies, he beheaded them. David swiped a finger across his throat. Dop, dop, dop. David explained that when Genghis Khan entered a defeated city, he would call in the local headman and have him stuffed into a crate. Over the crate would be spread a tablecloth, and on the tablecloth would be spread a wonderful meal. And then, while the man suffocated, Genghis ate, and he didn't even hear the man's screams. David still stood on the couch and put his finger in the air. So, I mean, this is really sick stuff and perverse. And so any normal human being who encountered this, I think, would find it rather revulsive. I think that's what's happening as people are hearing more and more about the atrocities being committed by the Israeli Defense Forces on the unarmed, starving, homeless, vulnerable population of Palestine. There's a kind of natural revulsion if you still have any humanity left. And this is what I find personally so very disturbing about the United States continuing to veto anything to stop this. This frankly borders on satanic as far as I can say. But Cliff, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, sure. I share your concerns, of course, and I've been following the Gaza situation since it started, and it's really horrifying. I've seen in recent days estimates as high as 700,000 dead Palestinians in Gaza. So the official number is 65 or 70,000, but I think Mrs. Albanese at the United Nations and others are thinking that it's several 100,000 dead, and 60% of the number is apparently women and children. So we could be looking at 500,000 dead, or 700,000, as some have said, dead under the rubble and not accounted for, and so on. So this is, of course, we can frame it in terms that it is satanic, and the United States is participating in it and encouraging it, actually, because Trump's son-in-law wants to have a real estate deal and have big buildings and seashore property and all of that. But it reflects, again, this elitist, globalist perspective. They're above everything, and they're just manipulating the planet. And these so-called terrorists, actually, the Hamas organization and similar, are not terrorists. They are actually what are called under international law, they have a right of resistance. These are resistance movements, and resistance movements to occupation. And the Israelis are occupying the West Bank and Gaza, and also Jerusalem, frankly. So under traditional international law, organizations that are resisting occupation are valid, are legal, like the French resistance against the Nazis in World War II. It was resistance organizations, and they do have a status in international law. So what we are seeing is an occupation of Palestine, and we can even go so far, if we want, to say that it's go back in history. I do in my other book that I wrote, which is called Dark Crusade. I trace the idea of a Zionist entity in the Middle East back to the British imperial policy. And the British, prior to World War I and during World War I, calculated that forming a Zionist state in the Holy Land region would give them a leverage in the Middle East in terms of economics and politics. So the British supported the Zionist entity that was created back then, and in the Balfour Declaration and so on, as an imperial tool. The Palestine, the Israeli part of Palestine, or the movement of Zionists to the Holy Land, was considered an imperial tool. And that imperial tool has been taken over by the United States after 1948, when the British pulled out its support, and the United States under Truman gave its support to what became the State of Israel. So today, the State of Israel is an imperial tool of the United States, you can argue. Some people argue that, the certain wealthy donor circles who are Zionists control U.S. policy and all of that, which there's reason to believe that. But the United States then has created what we could, in the old days, the empires had what they called protectorates. That is, states that the empire protected. So we can say that Israel is a protectorate of the United States and is fulfilling an imperial mission as an imperial tool for leverage and in the Middle East. But things are changing rather rapidly, and that recent Israeli attack on Qatar, I think, triggered the OIC meeting, in which, and now you have the nuclear-armed Pakistan signing a treaty or agreement with Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan's nuclear-armed missiles can reach Israel, by the way. I don't know if many people know that, but they can reach Israel. So therefore, Pakistan has just extended a nuclear umbrella to Saudi Arabia. And I would think that the other Gulfy, so-called Gulfies, Gulfy states might also warm up to Pakistan and want its nuclear umbrella. So what we're dealing with now out in the Middle East is quite a bit different from the last several decades of Israeli expansionism and oppression of the Palestinian people. What we're dealing with now, within the last week, by the way, is Pakistan extending a nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia. And also the Gulf states, et cetera, are now maybe leaning more toward China and Russia and so on for support, and leaning away from the United States, which is going to leave the United States isolated and castigated for its moral depravity over supporting the Gaza genocide, which the United Nations itself has now determined that it's genocide. And other international legal scholars have determined that it meets the criteria for genocide. So it's not a word that we cannot use. It's used now by international experts and international lawyers in the United Nations. So the United States, the net effect for us here in the United States is we have our participants in supporting genocide in Gaza and also in the West Bank, because there's more activity now over in the West Bank. So the situation is actually quite, it seems to get more dangerous by the week. And the quality of our national leadership, let me put it in an old-fashioned way, we can say that the president is misadvised, let's say. He has a problem with his advisors. We can phrase it in that gentle way.
Right.
And so I would just say there's a definite problem at the White House level and in the advice that the President of the United States is getting. And I think he wants peace, but I think he's completely misadvised.
Right. No, he doesn't seem to know how to get it. I just want to go back to your comments on Hamas to clarify at least my views on this matter, which is absolutely, if you are invaded and someone is occupying you, you have a right to resist. I don't think that includes October 7th. And I also am very suspicious about the narrative that we have about what October 7th was, because the timing of it was extremely fortuitous for Bibi Netanyahu, who was in a great deal of trouble in Israel. It also occurred not that long after the BRICS meeting in South Africa, where you suddenly had Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia still sort of waffling from what I can tell, the UAE. You had many new nations joining the BRICS. And by the way, Biden's narrative about Ukraine having the potential to win a war with Russia was falling apart. So it was very convenient to have a terror attack about which there would be enormous emotion in all directions, to kind of divert from the reality and to give Bibi Netanyahu what he wanted, which was an excuse to carry out the genocide and ethnic cleansing that he's been threatening to do for some time. And I think we're in a world where what everyone really has to understand is we are not going to resolve anything by killing more people. That is done. The type of weapons that exist today make that an extremely risky proposition. I deeply appreciated the retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Aguilar, who you both know as the whistleblower who went naively to work for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, thinking that he would actually do something to help feed starving people, discovered he was in a killing field, watched the IDF open fire on children, and came back to tell the tale. And I know that had a profound impact on two U.S. senators who just went over there, Van Hollen and Merkley, and who wrote a devastating report and who said very pointedly, anyone who tells you there's no starvation going on there is lying. And Lieutenant Colonel Aguilar gave a description of what happens when a depleted uranium I mean, it's not as big as a missile, but he said it was about, this size, goes through a tank. Between the speed, the shock front, and the radioactivity, he said it literally pulverizes, it liquefies human beings in the tank, and they are sucked out through the hole on the other side of the tank. Now that is sick. And anyone who thinks, and he said, I don't know why we do, what is the point of this? What is the point of human beings? Are you human if you engage in this? And frankly, the people who are pulverizing others and being pulverized are not even the ones in the argument. The ones in the argument are sitting there in their cushy desk chairs, taking their vacations on whatever, sending other people to die for their belief. And I think mankind really has to get out of this. And part of the threat probably that Charlie Kirk also represented was not merely that he was changing his own beliefs, but that he seemed to believe strongly in this idea of debate. And Americans, this is one of the most scary things that's happened in our country, I think, which is that somehow if you disagree with someone, I guess either you're supposed to kill them, or at the very minimum, you just can't talk to them anymore. You have to cut them off and go in your safe space. There's no idea that we might actually discover that we're wrong about something. Maybe you become a better person. Maybe you learn something you didn't know. Or your friend is very stubborn and they're wrong, but they're not going to get over it. And you say, well, okay, well, I still like, going fishing with you or whatever else, or we play in the same orchestra. So we don't agree on this. Okay, that's an interesting anomaly. We come back at it from another direction. That is normal human relations. What a boring world if we were all identical and had the same beliefs. But such is where we are. But Dave, any other thoughts on these matters from you?
Well, I was just thinking about, what you mentioned on the reaction from Tony Aguilar, which is obviously a completely human reaction to see this level of evil and destruction and to then want to do something about it. And I think for a lot of people witnessing what we see broadcast, or whether however people see it, a social media feed and so on, of the destruction in Gaza, the mutilation of children, just horrific scenes. I think for a lot of people, they have that same reaction, and they would either want to do something about it or go out and do something, whatever they can. I think for some people, though, it becomes a kind of desensitization, and I think at one level there are those that would like to capitalize on that, because if this just becomes almost accepted, or this is just another day of watching genocide, it's just another thing that comes across my feed, then that level of desensitization that occurs to that absolutely means that this can happen again anywhere. And I think that there is that social engineering element of the whole thing, and I think that people have to be aware of that, and make sure that they are committed to doing the right thing, or doing the good. Otherwise, this could happen anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think that, hold on here. That's the point. That's the threat. If we don't act now, it's not just that we're moral failures, it's that this will happen elsewhere. We're seeing in New York City a move where they're taking, in particular, a NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, buildings, otherwise known as projects. One of them is Chelsea. I think it might be Chelsea Gardens. I went and toured these homes, and they actually were in quite good shape. They weren't like some of the other public housing where you have contaminated water and rats, and they were in very decent shape. But it's a great location. It's not far from Hudson Yards. And they want to demolish the whole place, move everyone out, and put up new buildings. And some of the tenants there were showing me a new building they just built, which as soon as it was built, the boilers all gave out because the new construction is cheap. They're not interested. They don't spend the money to build quality. They just want the real estate to speculate on. So you have these old, sturdy, solid buildings. You're going to tear them down, move all the people out who are there. And what happens if people resist? I mean, how different? It's not the extreme quite yet, but when you decide that your priority is speculating on a building, as opposed to thinking that the children in this place might become the next Einstein or Beethoven, and that those are going to be the actual contributions to your society, you've totally lost your way. So I think we are going to have to wrap up pretty soon. So let me first go to Dave and ask if you have any concluding thoughts, words of wisdom, hope, or scary warnings.
Well, I think number one, the forces that Cliff discussed, and then what we've seen in terms of their action, whether it be the genocide ongoing in Gaza, the brutality of the battlefields of Ukraine, on both sides. Obviously, the Ukrainian soldiers are suffering in very high casualties. You know, these forces can be defeated. This system can be defeated. And I think on one level, at least not as maybe a silver bullet, but certainly in a way, yes, it is the question of Glass-Steagall. That there's a reason why which is the financial separation between investment banking and commercial banking, but more so what it did in 1933 as part of Roosevelt's reforms following the Depression is Glass-Steagall was an integral way of ensuring that credit was directed into the growth of the physical economy to actually benefit society as a whole. And when that was repealed and we went into a speculative frenzy, into this sort of casino royale, it allowed the types, the Bill Ackmans, the Adelsons, and these types to pool vast amounts of wealth and the ensuing political power, the control over the military industrial complex and those players who then of course control Congress and the political class. And if you want to take away their power, you've got to reform the banking system. You've got to reform the way that the economy is structured. And so there are solutions to this. That obviously was at the center of LaRouche's four laws of Glass-Steagall, a return to Hamilton's credit policy, but the physical economic development. Moreover, I think you're seeing the kind of physical economic development that LaRouche envisioned, which you're seeing in the Belt and Road Initiative. You're seeing it in the BRICS dynamic. The world is going back to the American system everywhere else except for the United States. So I think we need to go back to our American system. That's how you take the power away from these synarchist forces. And that's how you stop the bloodshed and the bloodlust that they both get off on, but also intend to brainwash us to make us think that that's the true nature of humanity when it's not. It's our creative potential expressed in scientific advances that we see in a real economy. So that's what I would just add as a final thought.
Great. Thank you. Cliff, any
Two
thoughts?
things. One, just to pick up on the Gaza situation and wrap it up. People have not been talking about the huge oil and gas deposits in the ocean offshore of where Gaza is, or all along that area, but particularly in Gaza. So there's, billions of dollars worth of oil and gas offshore of Palestine, or what is the traditional Palestine geography, which could be used to rebuild Palestine for the Palestinians. So I think the oil and gas issue is a very big one. Aside from Kushner and his little real estate deals, the oil and gas offshore, and that brings us to the synarchy. That brings us to the globalists who want to get their hands on the oil and gas off the shore of Palestine, and therefore the Palestinians wouldn't be able to benefit from that if there was a two-state solution there. Then you'd have a Palestine state, and then that state would have those oil and gas resources to develop from. The second point I would make, and I agree entirely with Dave on his exposition of things that can be done. What is to be done? Well, there's a lot to be done, but I think we have the 250th anniversary coming up, 1776, and so on. And that 250th anniversary year can spark a lot of thinking about us getting back to basic American principles and innovation, like Benjamin Franklin in his science and scientific and technology aspects, Hamilton in his financial aspects, and other of the founding fathers' era, Rittenhouse up there in Pennsylvania and all for science and technology. So we can touch base again with our American Republic, the founding fathers, the vision of a democratic constitutional republic, and that that behaves decently in the world and respects international law. And I think that's the kind of image of America we need to get ourselves back to and drop this sort of British imperialism policy that's been transferred to the United States since the Spanish-American War, we could say. 1898, we've been in an imperial phase. And I think we need to get back to more the spirit of the founding fathers and Declaration of Independence, and particularly George Washington's farewell address. So that would be how I'd wrap that.
Great. Thank you very much. And it really is refreshing to hear someone speak highly of the legacy of the United States, which is, after all, the whole point of why we fought the British. And we are in the 250th anniversary of that fight. I think it's really important. I also would add to what both of you have said. There is such a principle as natural law. And Cliff, you were talking about what's happened in the wake of this outrageous Israeli strike on Doha, when you had the top Hamas negotiator. I mean, this was, after all, talks to release the hostages that Netanyahu should care about, but doesn't, and end the genocide, of course, and also release some commensurate number, thousands of Palestinian prisoners who were languishing in horrible Israeli jails. And so the Israelis bomb this place. And it's such an affront to everything that what gathered in Doha was, I think, over 50 nations, Shia, Sunni, Persian, Arab, Asian, all kinds of governments that never would even speak with each other, that didn't even have diplomatic relations, who now have decided that Israel is a common enemy. That's very bad for Israel, but that is the way that they are being guided by the Jared Kushners of the world and their British advisors. And it will not work, because what is natural for human beings is actually not to fight each other, not to harm each other, but to think of the future, to think of what future generations will be like, to have optimism about what you can produce, about how the universe is developing, about things that are actually beautiful that we want to participate in, or that we would like our children or grandchildren to participate in. And that is very universal. And I think we're seeing this really flowering among the majority of the world's population. And it's hard to keep that in mind here in the United States, because the news media is absolutely part of this synarchist intelligence operation. So we don't think about it much, but we are only 4% of the world's population after all, and most of the world is not going in the direction that we are. I just fear for the consequences if we don't change here. And I think that that's very urgent. And I think that's why someone like Charlie Kirk would be targeted, not because he was such a genius or so great, but because of the potential and the way a figure like that could be used in committing this horrible crime to divide the United States, to divide and confuse the American people still further. And we have to fight that. So I want to thank both of you. I want to thank everybody for participating. I would like to urge everybody to sign up and do a regular monthly recurring donation to the LaRouche organization, so you get LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review news service, where qualified people like Cliff Kirakofe and Dave Christie write articles and help with our intelligence. And with any luck, we'll see everybody next week. So thank you very much for joining, and we'll be talking soon.